This is the story of how your life shapes your brain and how your brain shapes your life. For the past 20 years, I've been trying to understand what happens in 3 pounds of jello-like material somehow becomes us. What we feel, what matters to us, our beliefs and our hopes, everything we are happens in here. There are 100 billion neurons in the human brain. And each one of these is sending tens or hundreds of electrical pulses to thousands of other neurons every second of your life. And somehow, all of this activity produces your sense of reality. Imagine taking your laptop and tearing out half the motherboard and expecting it to still function. It would never work with a computer, but it can work with a young brain.
The brain doesn't forget how to move the arm, even though it hasn't moved in 10 years.
And grass.
What happens when we encounter something unexpected?
Orange, green, blue, red, blue.
That was amazing. We're not fixed. From cradle to grave, we are works in progress.
For Dr. David Eagleman. Thank you.
All right.
So I remember the moment I saw your TED Talk. Someone sent me the link before TED was over because they knew that I was into transformative technology, and they sent me the link, and I looked at it and I was like, my goodness. And I was so taken by your concept of the Umwelt and the expanding human sensory perception and what that could mean, not just for people who are dealing with challenges, but also for healthy people who are expanding into all of the possibilities. And that very much maps to transformative technology. I would love for you to tell everyone a little bit about that.
So I run a neuroscience lab. And one of the things we've been very interested in for a long time is this issue of sensory substitution, which is the idea of feeding information to the brain via an unusual sensory channel. And it turns out that this is actually totally possible to do because the brain is locked in silence and darkness in your skull, and all it ever sees are electrochemical signals, and it doesn't see anything more than that. And even though we call these things like, the optic nerve and the auditory nerve and somatosensory information and so on, the brain doesn't know. All it ever knows are spikes coming in. And so a long time ago, this led me to a hypothesis that the brain is essentially like a general purpose computing device. And it doesn't matter what kind of data you feed it, it'll just figure out what to do with it, how to extract patterns and assign meaning to that. And so the idea with sensory substitution is you can get information to the brain via other ways. So one example is in 1969, there was a paper in Nature of a scientist named Paul Bocchi-Rita, who used to be out here in San Francisco way back in the day. he took blind people and sat them in a modified dental chair, and he had these little solenoids that could poke people in the back. And he took a video camera and he put something in front of the video camera, and whatever was in front of the camera got poked into your back. And blind people got pretty good at seeing with the small of their back, because the information that they needed was getting to their brain. And there have been many modern incarnations of this, including, for example, the sonic glasses, where you've got a little video feed, a little camera here, and whatever is being seen is getting turned into sounds in your ears. So as you're moving through the world, you hear, and it's a cacophony at first, but people get pretty good at being able to navigate the world just based on what they're hearing. And one of the most modern incarnations is a device that sits on your tongue, and it takes a camera feed and translates that into, a feeling of pop rocks on your tongue. And blind people can get so good at this, they can see with their tongue. They can throw a ball into a basket or navigate a complex obstacle course. And so, this is the idea of sensory substitution. So in my lab, one of the things we've been interested in is coming up with a solution for deafness, for people who are totally deaf. And so what we did is we built a wearable that captures sound and breaks that up into frequencies and represents each of the frequencies with a different vibratory motor, which is actually all that your inner ear is doing. It's taking sound, breaking things up into frequencies in your inner ear, your cochlea, and then all of those are going off to the brain. So we ended up building this device, and what it does is it captures sound and dynamically turns that into patterns of vibration. And I don't know if you guys can see it or if it's too bright, but I'm wearing the vest right now, and as I'm speaking, what I'm saying is getting translated into patterns of vibration. Can you guys see this through the shirt a little bit? Okay. I'm going to just a little bit.
I think you're going to have to take it off.
This isn't the full Monty here, but it's a partial Monty here. All right. So just to demonstrate the point here. So as I'm speaking, there's this series of vibratory motors. And can you guys see the lights now? Okay. So I'm feeling the sonic world. And so for people who are totally deaf, this allows them to turn sound into patterns of vibration. Now, it sounds weird that they could ever come to understand this way, but as I said, this is precisely what your inner ear is doing. It's breaking things up into frequencies and getting that information to the brain. So deaf people, we've shown this a year ago, can learn how to understand the pattern, the language of the vest, and they can then understand what's being spoken. And then what Nicole is referring to is that we're also very interested in how we can use this kind of technology to feed in other kinds of senses and other kind of information into people's brains who are not deaf, who have perfect hearing, but they want a new kind of sense. And so that's a big part of what we've been pursuing, like feeding anything from stock market data to Twitter data to weather data. We're trying that to see if we can establish a new sensory experience for humans. I mean, more than just a sensory experience, a new, what philosophers call a qualia. So let me just take a 1 second tangent on this, which is hearing feels very different to you than seeing, which feels very different than touch and smell, right? These all feel like completely different issues that we're talking about. But to the brain, it's all just spikes. It's these electrochemical spikes. And so the question is, why do they feel so different? Nobody knows the answer to that. I think it's because of the structure of the data. Something about the structure of the data makes it feel a particular way. So we say, oh yeah, well that's vision, that's not hearing, those are completely different. But in fact, they're built out of the same blocks. And so my suspicion, although I won't know for many more months, but my suspicion is that we can actually feed structured data into the vest, and people will have a new qualia, another sense that's not vision or hearing or touch or smell or taste, but something else. And if they were to try to explain it to us, we would have no idea. It's like trying to explain vision to a blind person. There's no possibility that you can explain really what it is like to see. And it's the same thing where they have the Schmiegi sense, and they try to tell us what it is, and we wouldn't understand it. But I have a feeling that if you feed in structured data through a different pathway, that's what the brain will experience.
Well, one of the things that's so interesting about that to me, and I think for this community, is that transformative tech or the idea of transformation sits on two pillars, one being the extent to which I know myself and can use devices and signals to increase my self-awareness, whether it's a biosignal or, most of the people here are meditators, it's understanding self through meditation and being aware of data that comes up in that way, or knowledge of the extent to which I can deepen my connection to you because I can relate to you in a better way. And so I'm really curious about this vest and some of the other work that you do for deepening those two pillars. How could we extend our senses so that my senses could include your emotional state, how you're feeling, how you're thinking? How would your work apply to that?
So one of the things that I think this gives us is a capacity to see the invisible states of our body, like the health of my microbiome or my blood pressure or my heart rate, whatever it is. I can take things that we're able to measure with other devices and then just feed. We've got an open API on this so that you can feel any sort of signal. And we could feed that in so that you're consciously feeling it. So for example, the microbiome we're discovering has more and more influence on how you're feeling and thinking and so on. But boy, I can't access that. I don't know what it's doing. But wouldn't it be cool if I could consciously access the state of that? That's just an example of this issue of there's so many states of our health, of our body, that we can't access directly, and then you could with this sort of thing. Now, would that be useful? Who knows? We'll just, it's something we're going to try. As far as accessing someone else, knowing how you're feeling, imagine if I'm measuring the states of your physiology and then just transmitting that via Bluetooth to my vest. So, you might be stressed out or feeling happy or whatever the issue is, and you may or may not be putting on a social mask of some sort, but I would actually know how you're feeling in a better way than I can normally. I would have a deeper insight in how you're feeling because I'm feeling the signals that you're experiencing.
What about some of the things, like right before you came on, Yuval was talking about being able to pick up insight through voice. And so what you just showed was registering your voice and putting it into the vest. So theoretically, could you do the same thing with things that could be interpreted from other people's vocal?
Sure. If there was something, unfortunately, I only caught a minute of Yuval's talk, but if he's able to extract signals, any kind of data you can extract can then be fed in. So I'm just speculating on what he talked about, but if you're talking and there's some signal that I'm getting from your voice that you're happy or stressed or whatever, I could feed that in and say, oh, poor Nicole, she's feeling really stressed today, and oh, now she's feeling better about it, and I could feel that, yeah.
I think that's probably going to be like best for couples. It's probably going to be a great application.
That's right. Now, I've thought about this. I think it's an open question about whether you actually would want to be plugged into the physiology of your partner. Because there's a lot, I just think this is an open question for us to discuss at the break or something, but, there's a lot of masking that we all do. Somebody suggested to me, like, oh, we'd love this for our company where everyone can feel the physiological state of everyone else. And I said, wow, that sounds like a terrible idea because like, when someone goes in to give a talk, a boardroom presentation at the company, they might be really nervous, but they don't want you to know that. They want to appear confident and good and give the slides and be done with it. And if everyone's like, oh, geez, poor Fred is so stressed out, that's all they're concentrating on. So you'd have to find the right sort of scenario. Two very rooted, grounded people to do this with.
Well, one of the conversations that we had a while ago that just really stuck with me was, I love the work that you've done to popularize neuroscience. And one of the things you were talking about was how with the popularization of neuroscience, when people understand how their brain works, what that would mean for them in terms of understanding self and understanding others. And we talked about it specifically in terms of criminal justice, but I would love for you to talk a little bit about what you think the benefits of popularized neuroscience and how that can help educate people for knowledge of self and others, and just your work in that area with PBS and.
Yeah, the general story is, the ancient Greeks had this admonition to know thyself. And we're actually super terrible at knowing ourselves under normal circumstances. So, for example, I wrote this book, Incognito, a few years ago, which was all about all of the stuff running under the hood that your brain is doing. And the more I wrote that book and the more I really thought about all the stuff that's going on, I realized your conscious mind, which is the part of you that flickers to life when you wake up in the morning, that is the smallest bit of what's happening. That's the broom closet in the mansion of the brain. And your brain is taking care of so much stuff under the hood that you have no access to and no acquaintance with. And this applies to everything from your mood to your decision making to who you are as a person. As Carl Jung said, in each of us there is another whom we do not know. Or as Pink Floyd put it, there's someone in my head, but it's not me. And that's the situation that we find ourselves in. So part of my goal with writing books and doing the thing is to give a better, a more realistic sense of who we are. Just as one example, something I've been invested in for a long time is this issue about how we make decisions. And the bottom line is that you're not an individual, meaning not dividable. In fact, you're made up of all these different neural networks that all have their own goals and they're pushing for whatever. And so what's actually happening under the hood is like a neural parliament where you have different political parties that are all battling it out to steer the ship of state. And that's the sense in which humans can be conflicted, or they can argue with themselves, or you can cuss at yourself, you can cajole yourself, you can, if I put warm chocolate chip cookies in front of you, part of your brain wants to eat that because it's a rich energy source. Part of your brain says, don't eat it, you're going to get fat. Part of your brain says, okay, I'm going to eat it, but then I'll promise my spouse that I'll work out tomorrow. And this is, you can argue with yourself. All these things can happen, and it's because you're not one thing. And when we talk about building AI, it's always this thing of like, okay, it takes in the information, it makes a decision, it goes. But we're not like that. We're conflicted. And that's why you can, at different moments in your life, make completely different decisions about something. One day you can resist the cookies, one day you can't resist the cookies. So I think this kind of understanding is important because what it leads to is the capacity to do rational things like something I talked about in the PBS series, just as an example, is this idea about a Ulysses contract. How many people know what a Ulysses contract is? Has anyone heard of that? Okay, great. This is great because this is a very super important thing. So Ulysses, when he was coming back from the Trojan War, he also goes by Odysseus. When he was coming back from the Trojan War, he realized that they were going to pass the island of the Sirens, where there was these women who would sing songs so beautiful that everyone wanted to hear it, but it would cause them to crash into the rocks. So do you guys remember what he did? Exactly. What he did is he lashed himself to the mast. He made all his men put beeswax in their ears so they couldn't hear what was going on. And he said, just row. No matter what I do, no matter how much I'm screaming or whatever, that I want to go to the women over there on the island, just keep rowing. So what was happening is, before they got there, the Ulysses of sound mind was making a contract with the future Ulysses. He was making sure that the future Ulysses would behave correctly. And because he knew that given that future situation, that Ulysses would behave badly. So that's why he lashed himself to the mast. And this kind of contract with your future self is what we call the Ulysses contract. And when you really deeply understand, everyone here, whatever, meditate, you guys probably all understand this, but when you really deeply understand the degree to which you are different people at different moments in time, that allows you to set up these Ulysses contracts so that you will behave right when you're in a situation that you would behave poorly in.
Well, one of the things that I'm amazed by is that you have started so many ventures, and you have sort of I feel like you probably have an endless number of things that you would like to explore. One of the things that we find really, that's core to this conference, you see that there's for the content we have scientists and then we have entrepreneurs. And you are a scientist entrepreneur. You have done both and are bringing that out into the world. I would love for you to tell the crowd a little bit about some of the different companies that you've started, because you're also David's on the TransTech 200 list for reasons that are really obvious, I think. And so he's got several ventures, and I'd love for you to share it with the crowd, because most of the people here are entrepreneurs.
Great.
And scientists.
Great. So one of the ventures is this vast And we've built several different form factors of this. We can feed in all kinds of data. One of the main things we're doing is we're building this with, I mentioned this before, with an open API, advanced programmer interface, so that you can feed in any kind of data you want. So you can try out various things. We're doing experiments with pilots where they're, instead of looking at each gauge in the cockpit one at a time, they're feeling multidimensionally what's happening with the whole plane. Or factories where you can feel all the machines operating and you know the normal pattern, and then you can tell if things are going off a little bit. We're trying all kinds of things we're doing with prosthetics and so on. So that's all under the umbrella of this company I have called Neosensory. Okay, so then I've got a completely separate company called BrainCheck, which just uses a tablet to measure various things about what's happening under the hood. So you just play these little games. They're very simple games, and we can tell things right away about, we're measuring your reaction time and various, and we can tell about your cognition and your perception and your decision making just based on how you do on these little games. That gives us a multidimensional score, which tells us, for example, whether you've been concussed or not. So we're using this with high schools. So all the athletes take the test at the beginning of the season, and then if they've hit their head, they just step to the sidelines, take the test, and we can tell whether they've been concussed or not. We're also using a version of that for dementia. So this is for cognitive tracking, where you play these little games. Every 2 months, the tablet bings you and tells you to play the game again. And we can tell if you start cognitively declining. We can tell right when people are turning the corner. And the reason this is so important is because there exist all sorts of pharmaceuticals for dementia, but once you're demented, it's too late. And so it's during the stage of mild cognitive impairment that it's really important to catch that. But most people don't catch it because somebody starts getting cognitively impaired, but their family makes excuses, and they make excuses, and they don't come into the hospital until it's way too late. So there's that. I've got another company that's just it's just a software play for justice systems, because I direct the Center for Science and Law, which is about the intersection of neuroscience and the legal system. And one of the things I noticed on the way was how unbelievably inefficient justice systems are from the time someone gets arrested to the time they go to court to the time they get a final disposition, the jail sentence. The same paperwork gets typed up 4 times. So I just thought, this has got to be solved. So I made a cloud-based secure software to solve that problem. So yeah. Anyway,
Awesome.
And then I'm about to launch another one. Actually, I hadn't said this out loud yet, so this is the first. But there's a whole other area of my research that has to do with time perception. This is a longer story, but I'll just say that the tentative conclusion I've come to is that schizophrenia, at bottom, has a problem with time perception. I know that probably sounds wacky, but anyone's interested, I can talk to you more about this issue. It's just that, I'll just do this in one sentence. Your brain puts out motor acts and it gets sensory feedback, and this is how it judges causality. It says, oh, okay, I intended to put out an act, I heard that and I felt it, so it must have been me. But if you were to, do something and a light were to turn on just before you did it, you'd say that's not me. And it turns out that in my lab, we showed some years ago that we can take anybody and manipulate the timing so that they say, whoa, that wasn't me who caused it, even though they were the ones who caused it. And the first time I saw that, I realized that's what is happening with schizophrenia. There's this credit misattribution that happens where people with schizophrenia say, that wasn't me. And then it's completely rational, actually, that they make up another explanation for what it was about. The other thing, this is the last thing I'll say. The other thing is that you're constantly having a conversation with yourself. You're always generating an internal voice and listening to it. And if you're thinking, what internal voice? That's the internal voice. So imagine that you got the timing of that wrong, though, where between when you generate the voice and you hear it, that would be an auditory hallucination. You'd have to attribute the voice to someone else, because it would be as though you suddenly heard a voice if you were getting the timing between motor action and sensation incorrect. So what I realized is that I think schizophrenia is at bottom a timing issue, and that opens the door to all kinds of new rehabilitative strategies instead of pharmaceuticals. And so that's the next company I'm spinning off.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So I would love to know, what are you the most excited about in neuroscience? Like, what are a couple of things or one thing that you're like, this thing, when this is solved, it will be amazing?
Well, right now, our technology for measuring the brain really stinks. So we have things like EEG, which stinks. It's listening on the outside of the brain. It's like trying to figure out the structure of baseball from attaching some microphones on the outside of a stadium and you hear the crack of the bat, and you hear some cheering, and you try to figure out what baseball is about. It'd be very difficult. We have things like fMRI, which allows us to see into the brain, to eavesdrop on what's happening there, but only at a very crude scale. I mean, we're listening to voxels, which are three-dimensional pixels. We're seeing voxels at a time. We can divide the brain relatively small, a few millimeters on a side, but that contains millions of neurons in each voxel, and that's way too big. So, we all, my lab and other labs, we all do this stuff with fMRI. We say, oh, you do this, and this set of Christmas tree lights light up, and this, and you do this other. But it's really crude. And what I can't wait for is for the technology to develop to a point where we can actually listen to tens of thousands of neurons individually. That's where we're going to start getting real progress. I'm a scientific advisor on a new company that was just launched called Kernel, and the idea is, how do we really get read-write capacity, where we can read from many billions of neurons and we can write to many billions of neurons, because that's when things will really open up. And so we're exploring various sorts of technologies to get there. It's a long play. It's 10 years out, but that's what we're trying to figure out.
That's sort of like one of my favorite books was Ramez Nam's book, Nexus, and they talk about read-write capacity to the brain.
Cool.
Well, I think this is a really good time for questions.
Great.